forcing everybody to come up with a stupid idea. Like that's one way of just like, I don't care what you come up with, you have to have at least one idea that's stupid. And now it's suddenly like nobody cares if they have a stupid idea. It's a requirement to have one.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the Being an Engineer podcast. Today we're speaking with Jim Gabriel, who is a seasoned engineering leader with expertise spanning medical device, technical consulting in the nuclear power generation, aerospace and consumer products industries, and commercial construction. Most recently as Associate Director of Engineering at Abiomed, he led teams in developing cutting-edge heart pump technologies that save lives. With a bachelor's in industrial and manufacturing engineering and a master's in engineering management, Jim is now launching a company focused on project and program management consulting, PMO optimization, and training to help organizations accelerate their engineering processes, which is perfect because this is a new episode in our ongoing series about how to accelerate the speed of engineering. So, Jim, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks, Aaron. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. So before we get into a heavy discussion about how to accelerate the speed of engineering, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that most commonly act as bottlenecks and slow down engineering. What are some activities or communications or barriers that you've seen over the years that tend to slow teams down?
Yeah, I think the biggest bottlenecks in engineering projects that really kind of dampen the pace is underperforming teams, and particularly those who lack decision-making ability. But then there's other things like unclear requirements. That's always a source of confusion. And then not having a process defined to manage changes. Change is inevitable, particularly in a project. Projects are, their really sole purpose is to implement some change or make an improvement or something. And so, if you don't have a good process for managing changes, I can see those being, really kind of the main factors in being bottlenecks to slow down projects.
Will you talk just a little bit more about the inability to make decisions? Where have you seen this play out, and what effects have you seen that make?
Yeah, I think I've seen it play out in many projects where either the team doesn't know that they have the ability to make decisions, or they don't know where they're able to make decisions, or they don't know how to make decisions well with, taking into consideration good data to rapidly make informed decisions. And so usually it's cases where, it's a simple little change of just giving the autonomy to the team to make those decisions. But I've seen it play out in almost every facet, every job I've had, every company I've been with, where, you sort of fall into this trap, or there's a level of bureaucracy, or it becomes unclear, when do we need to go as a team for approval versus when do we have sort of that autonomy to make the decision and move ahead. And that's always, a challenge.
Do you think that the ability to make good decisions, is that more related to having been trained on how to make decisions, or simply having the experience and the confidence to do so?
Probably a little of both, but I think ultimately it's probably the latter. The experience of just going through the motions and realizing, I think from my experience, it's been the trial and error of making a decision, finding out it's the wrong decision, and then still feeling good that we made it, because having not made a decision would have been far worse. And I think, that's something that's uncomfortable for all. I think the Pareto principle comes into play, where, you get 80% of your outputs from just 20% of the information. And, being able to rapidly make decisions on 20% of the information is sometimes uncomfortable because there's the unknown unknowns. But, depending on what decision you're making and how impactful it is, it's a lot of times better to just make it and move on, find out it's wrong and have to come back than get into this sort of paralysis of assessment
Yeah.
to make sure you've got it just perfect.
Right. Yeah. I remember the first internship I had, my boss was telling me about how he got hired and he interviewed with the president of the company. And I remember him telling me that he told the president of this company, I won't always know the right decision to make, but I do know how to make a decision, even if it ends up being the wrong one. And I remember hearing that and thinking to myself, that sounds like an awful thing to say. Why would you tell the person who might be hiring you that I might make wrong decisions? And as I've grown in my career, I've realized the wisdom in that, right? You're never going to know for sure what the right decision is 100% of the time, but just making a decision and moving forward, like you said, if it's the wrong decision, you'll learn that, and then you can double back and course correct as needed. Well, that kind of leads to the next question. You mentioned having the experience to know what the right decision is. Younger engineers or even more senior engineers who perhaps lack experience in a particular area will sometimes spend too much time trying to solve a problem before they approach someone else and ask for help. What is the balance between allowing these engineers to struggle through it on their own and build that muscle of figuring things out on their own versus stepping in and saying, hey, it looks like you might be struggling. That's fine. We all struggle, but let me help you with this, or pointing the engineer to someone else and saying, that person can help you with this. Why don't you go talk with them and let's make some progress? What do you think the right balance is there?
I don't know if there's really a balance. I think a couple points. One, I think being in engineering is an area of innovation. And I think innovation creates new things. It's new ideas that have to be proven. There's some new hypothesis that has to be proven out. And so there's always some level of uncertainty. So I think just the fact of being in an innovative environment is going to bring and drive that sort of figure stuff out muscle. So I think it's always appropriate to ask. And I think if we go to the root of the problem there, I think the majority of people just feel uncomfortable, either looking stupid or feeling stupid. And for me, my experience has been that creating a network of mentors that are prescribed as such, and that's the relationship you have, has been very helpful to kind of break that barrier down. And I've done this in many ways. And I feel strongly that everybody should have some mentor, whether you're, fresh out of school, junior engineer, or you've been in a career for 20 plus years, myself included. I have mentors that are specific. I have somebody that I've reached out to and said, hey, look, I'd love to engage with you on the topic of leadership. I'd love to engage with you on the topic of technical engineering and technical knowledge. And, we'll meet once a month or once a week or whatever the cadence is. And it's specific to me bringing things out and you giving advice because A, I respect it. B, you've got a lot more experience than I do in this area, and I'm acknowledging that. And so there's no point in me trying to reinvent the wheel. I'd rather, if you know the answer, give me the answer, and let's talk about what you don't know that I can go explore and foster that innovation. And I think that's a good way to approach it. But having somebody that's dedicated to that sort of role as a mentor, I think helps break down that barrier. In my experience, it's been really rewarding having those sort of relationships set up.
That's a great answer. I tend to agree with that pretty strongly. Actually, I would certainly bias my efforts on if someone knows the answer, just go ask what the answer is and move on. And there are going to be times when nobody does know the answer. And those are the times where you get to exercise your figuring it out chops, as it were. But otherwise, if someone knows it, there's usually not much reason to spend your own time trying to figure it out. Just get the answer and move on. Failing fast and failing inexpensively is a topic that I think a lot of engineers have heard. They're almost kind of buzzwords: fail fast, fail cheap. Are there any tools that you have seen used effectively to do those things?
Yeah, I think, rapid prototyping, early stage engineering, like getting that out there and breaking it is important. So from a tools perspective, there's ways to be efficient with materials. 3D printing is a big thing nowadays that really enables, in a lot of ways, something to be rapidly produced, to inform yourself and really get to that fail fast state. But I think there's also, this sort of mindset to consider of not finding the sweet spot at first. And this is maybe less a tool and more just that mindset of defining your sort of border of a sandbox and forcing yourself to fail. It's so easy to put a prototype in place with the objective of it works, right? Everybody tries to build something to prove that it works. And I find it's effective to really stretch the limits and explore those areas of the sandbox, so to speak, where you think something's going to fail. Go a little bit further and then prove that it fails, right? I think that is a little more enlightening, particularly early on, because the surprises come when it works and you think it would have failed, right? You built it too long or too large or too soft or too whatever, whatever the attribute is. And then it works and it works okay. Now you've got a bigger sandbox to play in. And, maybe that's not the most critical factor to be focused on because there's a lot of design margin there. And so I think that sort of break it fast mentality in my mind is a little less about the tool. And while there are tools that enable it, I think it's that mindset of making sure you're failing and not succeeding in the early stages.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. If you are only succeeding, I think one of the risks that you run into is the things that you've tried, work, but then you get into production and inevitably there are going to be processes and tolerances that rear their ugly heads that maybe you didn't foresee or test during development. And all of a sudden you have failures. So like you said, pushing the limits of what is known to work, I think that's a really effective process to go through. And now you have a much better understanding of what your sandbox is. You mentioned leadership a little bit ago, engaging with mentors on leadership. What role does leadership play in accelerating engineering projects? Or are there any stories that come to mind that you can share about how leadership affected the speed of an engineering project?
Yeah, I mean, leadership in my mind is crucial to this accelerating engineering projects. And I think it goes back to the culture. And really, I think I've been in organizations that really kind of pride themselves on being an idea meritocracy. And that enables autonomy within the teams. Anybody can have a good idea, but that's something that has to be from the top down really supported. And it's a cultural thing that's fostered over time. But that all stems back to leadership and what is the culture that leadership is building for the organization? That drives decentralized command where there's the leader that really has this sort of vision, defining what the outcome should look like and be, but not the how to get there, what exactly to do, and leaving that up to the team to define and do back briefs along the way and, establish this sort of proof that we're on the right track, or, having that sort of open idea meritocracy. That's a really good idea. Try this instead. That can come from anybody. So, I think, but leadership in general plays a pivotal role, and I think it flows down through the whole organization. I've certainly been in cases where we've, had engineering projects that were being directed by the person in charge of the program or project that had ultimate accountability. And, there were statements made of, you have to do it this way, and this is the way we're going to do it step by step by step. And, nobody's bought into that. I mean, people go through the motions and do it, but there's no heart in it. And that's the trade-off. And I think that's when, push comes to shove, things start to go wrong, which they always do. The people really aren't invested that are on the team to really own it and take control and make it successful. And I think that's in a lot of ways what's required. And the leadership piece of that, I think, comes back to giving that autonomy to the team, right? Outlining what the vision is and what the outcome looks like, what success feels like, and then letting the team be creative and come up with the ideas of how to get there. And that builds that collaborative environment. And, my experience is when that happens, it's always surprising, where the successful or the solutions come from. right? Sometimes it's somebody that's, I've had situations where a co-op has brought up good ideas and nobody had thought of, and it's just like the light bulb goes on and it's like, that's fantastic. Let's go do that.
I love it. Oftentimes, I think good ideas can be stifled. You mentioned the idea meritocracy, which is a great phrase. I love that. But good ideas can be stifled if team members don't feel psychologically safe to speak their minds. If they're worried about, well, what is this individual going to think of this idea? Or I keep seeing other people's ideas get shot down. Why should I share mine? What have you seen to be effective in creating a psychologically safe environment where team members, engineers feel very safe sharing their true thoughts and not holding things back because of politics or bureaucracy?
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to do. And I think the emotional intelligence comes into play on that a little bit. But there's many ways to do it, right? And I think just having some forethought into the fact that there's different personalities, people operate differently. There's, the Myers-Briggs says there's people that are really, really heavy thinkers, right? So, or there's introverts that don't like to really speak up in public or be very chatty. And, so reverse engineering that a little bit of like, how do we get ahead of that, right? So there's a meeting that, we need to gather input and, sending out the questions well in advance so that the thinkers have time to really digest it and come up with a articulated response. Or you leave that meeting where decision's made and leave a channel of communication that's open so that the introverts can then kind of digest it. And if they have an issue, they come back and through that open communication channel, one-on-one can feed it back to you after the meeting concludes. But then there's also just kind of like breaking down those barriers of uncomfortableness that people have. Like I've done brainstorming sessions where, we'll split up and everybody gets involved because we spend time at the beginning just in isolation, individually coming up with these ideas and forcing everybody to come up with a stupid idea. Like that's one way of just like, I don't care what you come up with, you have to have at least one idea that's stupid. And now it's suddenly like nobody cares if they have a stupid idea. It's a requirement to have one. So that's, that's just one method. But I think thinking through, why would people not want to do this? What are the barriers for their, lack of contributing or speaking up or, whatever it may be, and thinking, kind of how do we avoid that to begin with? What's an environment I can set up to create the, that this sort of comfort that people can just break that barrier down.
I like your idea of stupid ideas. That's brilliant. I have a friend who refers to this as McDonald's ideas. He's a leader himself, and they'll go to lunch as a team occasionally, and the question will always be, where are we going to go to eat? And nobody wants to throw out a suggestion, so he'll say, let's go to McDonald's, knowing that nobody wants to go to McDonald's. And when other people on the team hear their leader say, let's go to McDonald's, they feel more comfortable throwing out their own suggestions, which is really the same thing that you just said in a different sort of setting. Let me take a real short break here and share with the listeners that the Being an Engineer podcast is brought to you by Pipeline Design and Engineering, where we don't design pipelines, but we do help companies develop advanced manufacturing processes, automated machines, and custom fixtures complemented with product design and R&D services. Learn more at teampipeline.us. The podcast is also sponsored by The Wave, an online platform of free tools, education, and community for engineers. Learn more at thewave.engineer. And we are privileged today to be speaking with Jim Gabriel. Jim, let's talk a little bit about best practices for ensuring smooth collaboration, specifically across cross-functional teams. You've got your electrical engineers and your mechanical engineers and your software engineers. Are there things that you've done or seen done that have made that cross-functional communication process more efficient?
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, building that team, right? If it's a team, it warrants team building and understanding that new teams need to kind of form and then go through that storming phase before they're actually, norming and performing. And I think understanding that is important so that you can give it the attentions needed, that, that you foster those relationships in the onset and people are building their rapport with one another. So that, when challenges come up, and they often do, there's not hard feelings, but they're working together to solve it. And I think, there's also that level of ownership across the team and making sure that priorities are paired well. It's always a challenge. And I've had a challenge in the past where, I've had a lead on a team that, from a different functional area, where their priority is something other than this design development project. And that's always challenging, because when push comes to shove on whatever their other objective is, that's going to win out over, the development project for their time and attention and focus. And, trying to have the discussions beforehand of, there's this whole other part of the team that's, this is their priority, and making sure that cross-functionally they're bought in, and that they're going to take a sense of ownership for what they're signing up for. I think that helps with the collaboration, and then having transparency, right? I think, when things do fall down, understanding why and having everyone understand why that's on the team is important. And, the fact that somebody's on the team cross-functionally and this is not their priority is a nice, important thing to know, right? So when they get challenged, everybody knows this is not going to be the thing they run to. So we've got to come up with the mitigations to sort of have that backfilled, in the event that they get pulled away, and that, the thing that is their priority pulls their attention away, that we can still fill in the gaps and know when to do that. There's a good book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution that I think it's a Franklin Covey book, but the 4 disciplines are focus wildly on the wildly important goal. So as a team, you're really defining what's the most important thing that we need to do, and then acting on leading measures, setting those leading measures up, and then actually measuring them and acting on those, keeping a scoreboard, and then a cadence of accountability. And those are the 4 disciplines. And I put those into practice and found that it's very rewarding. And, as simple as, for example, reviewing documents. Nobody likes doing that. And in medical device space, you got to have all these cross-functional reviews and people sign off on things. And there's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of documentation that needs to be reviewed. And I've had a case in a project I've run where, we need to get these things done and buttoned up and put in a design history file to stay on track, and we're behind. And we've got 20 documents, whether they're drawings or work instructions or whatever they are, need to be reviewed and signed cross-functionally, and couldn't get people to do that for the life of us as a team. And once we started tracking that and we put a scoreboard in place, it was amazing. It was like a switch just got flipped, and suddenly we had people out of quality and people out of our manufacturing who weren't giving it any attention. Suddenly didn't want to be the loser on the scoreboard, where everybody else has worked their way through 20 documents and they're the ones on number 2. And so I think keeping a compelling scoreboard that's front and center, and then, when it comes to the end of the week or end of whatever the period is you set up, reviewing that and being transparent, like what's going on? Are you the wrong person for this project? You said you were going to do this. What, did something get in the way? Do we need to, we need to find somebody else to take your place for a period of time? Like what, let's work through an amicable solution here, because it's not fair to the team. And so I think all of that stuff, kind of feeds into the collaboration and fosters a good sort of cross-functional team and their performance.
Measuring data is so huge, and it seems simple, right? Just measuring the progress that each team member made on a day or over a week. It seems so simple, but it's, like you said, so powerful. I remember a situation where, this was several years ago, we had similar to you, a ton of drawings, except we had truly a ton. We had, I think it was about 300 drawings that we needed to complete in a 2-week time period. Thankfully, we had a lot of team members that we were able to throw at it, but we had about 7 days to finish all of these drawings. And so we put together, I wouldn't call it a scoreboard necessarily. It was more like just a document that listed all the different drawings, and then there were, check boxes next to each one. And everyone had an assignment of what they were doing. And then we would track it at the end of every day. We'd look at it and see how many drawings do we need to do each day to be on track to finish at the end of a week, and how many did we do today? Did we do enough? Good. Let's keep up this pace. And there were a few times, we didn't have. No, it wasn't 7 days. It was 2 weeks. I misspoke. So there were a couple of times where we saw, we're falling behind now, and we were able to make adjustments really quickly because we had that data right in front of us. We may have had to pull another team member in and just put more hands on it, but just the ability to look at data and measure it and extrapolate out and then make changes as needed on the fly was so powerful. And it seems like such a simple thing, right? Just looking at the data, measuring it, and making decisions based on that. But wow, so powerful.
It is a simple thing. It always is. It's always, it's not complex. It's just hard to do with discipline. I think that's the challenge. It's little things.
A lot of the things that you are talking about, to me, they really are coming back to leadership, right? Because you need to have a leader who's high level looking at all of these things, who's assessing the data and making decisions, and understanding that team members are going to want to think about things. So let's put the questions out there before the brainstorming session so they have a chance to think about them. So much of this really does come back to leadership, having the right person in the captain's seat, guiding the ship, so to speak. Well, let's see. Have you ever had an experience where you introduced a new technology or a tool that significantly reduced the amount of time required on a given project?
Yeah, I've introduced technologies. I mean, there's project management softwares like Smartsheet or Wrike, or, utilizing Minitab for statistical analyses, or even at enterprise levels of, engaging with product lifecycle management or PLM software or system. And they help. I think they help keep things organized, and they perhaps matter to some degree. But I think there's more to it than that, than just the technology or the tool. And I think it all kind of the tool gets layered on the process, right? So like you have different hammers, for example, but if you don't know how to actually hit a nail, doesn't matter what hammer you use. So I think, the development approach being aligned with the sort of the maturity of the project, right? If you're in early stage, iterating through concepts and things like that, using a more agile approach versus, a very sort of waterfall approach of execution, running Scrum sessions or ad hoc Scrum sessions to, really be agile and be able to kind of shift gears on the fly as a team is important. And I think those project management softwares I mentioned, for example, they're easy to flip back and forth between those methods. And, a lot of them have, the card views that can be arranged in lanes of work. And so they just help keep organized. But I think ultimately it's the process and the development approach that matters. With the PLM experience, we were actually, I was in a project that we were trying to decide on the right PLM tool to implement in the organization. And, we went through that, and, they had pros and cons, but that wasn't the root of the problem that the business was seeing. It was the fact that the underlying process was inefficient. I mean, we had, too burdensome of a process for the stage that the product life cycle was in, right? In the early stage, there were too many people required to sign off on, just getting to a point where we could purchase material to build a prototype. I mean, there shouldn't be anybody having to sign off on that. An engineer should just be able to go do it. But the system we were working in, the process that we had set up at that business was, unfortunately, a little too burdensome. And obviously you need to have those checks and balances when you get later in the stage. But it comes back to the process, the business processes that the tools lay on top of. They have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, that reminds me of how we do purchasing here. We don't have a purchasing department. We're pretty small company, so maybe that's not so atypical for a company our size. But when engineers need to buy something, material to build a prototype, for example, they just buy it. Everyone has access to our Amazon account and to our McMaster-Carr account and all the other different vendors that we work with. And I've had others kind of question me on that before, saying, how can you do that? How can you just let the team buy whatever they want? Chaos will reign and budgets will skyrocket, and this is going to be a problem. And what I've found is that maybe 5% of the time there are problems. We buy things that maybe we shouldn't have bought, but 95% of the time, and maybe it's even higher than that. Maybe it's 2% and 98%. The point is, the vast majority of the time, it streamlines things and helps us move quickly. And maybe there are a few isolated incidents where we shouldn't have spent that money. We shouldn't have bought that thing. But why hold up 98% of the progress because 2% of the time there are some minor problems? Has always been my thought on that. And I look at other companies where it's 2 weeks before they can order screws because they have to go through this purchasing department and requires all these layers and sign-offs. Anyway, that's been my experience.
That's terribly painful for the team that has to go through it.
Yeah. Are there any unconventional approaches that you have taken to expedite engineering processes? I'll let you define what you consider unconventional.
Yeah, I don't know if it's really unconventional. I think at times it feels unconventional, but I like to lead without authority and really provide that sort of servant leadership. I feel very strongly that goes a long way. It kind of forces one to be creative, to sort of balance the motivation of the team, drive that sense of ownership, foster new ideas, but also building up that credibility where the flip side is being very directive. When you pull that out, it's okay, and sometimes it's warranted, right? When there's a fire in the building, you have to say, "Get out now!" Not, "How do you guys want to get out of the building?" So, so I think that that I don't know if it's really unconventional, but I've had people tell me, this is not a democracy. You need to lead and make a decision. But I try not to sweat the small stuff. I think. I'd rather think I know the answer to something and then have the rest of the group come up with the same or at least close to the same answer and own it, rather than me always just telling them what to do. And so, if that can be done in the same amount of time and get to the same results in the end, I'd rather go that pathway than just being directive. So again, I don't know if it's unconventional, but it's probably unconventional to some.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is unconventional to some, which always kind of shocks me when I come to that realization, because I'm like you. I don't like to, frankly, I shouldn't be telling people what to do, because a lot of the engineers here are better at engineering than I am. So it doesn't make any sense for me to try and dictate how things are done. Just let the smart people do. Was it Steve Jobs, I think, who said, why would we hire smart people and then tell them what to do? We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do.
Yeah, right.
Communication, obviously, is a big deal when it comes to moving quickly and executing on any complicated project. Are there any tools or strategies that you have used to enhance communication within your team?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people don't understand what communication is. So I think, coming up with a good, purposeful communication plan is important. And, sometimes it's just kind of sharing knowledge with folks on the different forms of communication. There's written, there's verbal, there's push communication, there's pull communication, there's dialogue you can engage with. And, so leveraging all those when they're effective. I mean, that's one thing. And, some of that leads into stakeholder management and, reporting and what to report, but this all gets peripheral and sort of outside of the team. Within the team, I think, of course, there's tools. There's, MS Teams or Slack or email or in person. Again, back to the tool, I think it just sits on top of a process and helps stay organized. But I think a lot of communication, particularly in the team, comes in the form of meetings. And I've been in environments where, meetings basically capitalize one's day depending on your role in the organization. And there's another good book called Death by Meeting. I don't know if it's good. It's like a fable by Patrick Lencioni. I think he also wrote the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, a couple other books like that. But he took an interesting spin on meetings in the sense that he kind of compared them to entertainment. And so there was whether you have an advertisement or a 30-minute TV show or a movie or a saga or a series of movies, they kind of translate to meetings. And there's 2 main problems with meetings. They're either boring or they're ineffective or both. And the solution for having a boring meeting, kind of leveraging back on the entertainment industry is have a good hook and then mine for drama and conflict, right? So anybody can sit there and say, this is what's going well, this is what's happening. But if you've got teammates that are not getting along, bringing that up in the meeting, and, or if you've got indecisiveness or, there's a dilemma that needs to be ironed out, I think those are the things that make meetings entertaining and keep people and get them engaged, right? When 2 people are arguing, I think, as long as it's a productive argument, people will get engaged and have opinions and weigh in. And then on the ineffective side, when meetings are ineffective, the one thing that this author in this fable sort of alluded to were the 4 different types of meetings: of a daily check-in, a weekly tactical meeting, a monthly strategic meeting, and then usually a quarterly offsite. And so you can kind of leverage those, and he compares those to the daily stand-up being an advertisement. It's short, 5 minutes daily. There's no agenda, right? You just show up and you talk about what the fire is for the day or what needs to happen that day. Weekly tactical might have a lightning round or a real-time agenda where you spend the first 10 minutes defining what the agenda is. What are the important topics for the week that we need to sit here and discuss and debate? Again, mining for that conflict. And then monthly strategic and quarterly offsite, get a little more in the weeds with detailed agendas and that sort of stuff. But I think having a purposeful meeting and understanding that you're going into a meeting as part of a communication tool, this is the intent here is to communicate as a team, and then understanding what the outcome of the meeting is. Are we making a decision? Is this just an update so that everybody's aware of what's going on? Are we debating something and not making a decision? So I think kind of coming into these with an understanding of what the purpose is, keeping and tracking action items, that sort of stuff really make for effective meetings and drive the communication in the team so that you're, everybody's clear on what the plan is, what needs to happen, why it needs to happen, so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful answer. In our meetings, we have an action item list at the bottom. And one of the things we've done that I think has been really helpful is there is someone assigned to take notes during the meeting. And that individual is also responsible for communicating the action items to team members who have action items. And then I think even that would be helpful. But what's even more helpful is everyone knows that at the start of the next meeting, the first thing we're going to do is look at those action items and talk about, all right, what's done, what isn't done. And we're going to go down the list, and each list has someone assigned to, that item. And so your name's going to be called, and we're going to say, is this done? Is this done? Is this done? And there's some accountability. And again, these simple tools, right? But they're powerful. They're very effective.
Yeah.
Have there been any experiences you've had where an attempt to accelerate engineering has backfired? And what can we learn from this?
Yeah, certainly. I think most of them come back to kind of one core principle of having the right amount of strategic planning, and understanding, when you're trying to accelerate engineering or, accelerate the activities that you're working on, there's really 2 ways to do that. You can either fast track, in which you're basically running activities in parallel that would otherwise be sequential, or you're crashing the schedule by adding resources, throwing money. If there's a make or buy decision, you do both and see which one gets done first. right? Because the buy one is easy, and but the thing to keep in mind there is that you're adding risk. No matter what you're doing to accelerate, it's increasing the risk that something's going to go wrong. There's got to be rework. You've spent more than you thought. There's these sort of system level effects of it's hard to estimate and understand the budgets and how much things cost, because sometimes it gets chaotic and a bit out of control when you're just striving to accelerate. And so I think understanding that you're adding risk and then accepting that and then managing that risk is important. And I think that, in my experience, and there's been many, so many projects we try to accelerate, and there's little backfires and there's big backfires, but the ones that come out successful are the ones where we have done all we can to mitigate the risk and sort of stay on top of that. I think the other lesson that I've learned is related to that, but there's this triple constraint triangle, or people call it the iron triangle, where you have sort of resources versus scope versus schedule. And, usually you can pick two of the three, but not all three. But in the center lies quality. So if you can optimize all of those things, you have a really high quality project in the end that provides a good result that's sufficient, right? Hasn't used too many resources, the right amount of scope, delivering strategic value, and it's on time. It didn't take a long time to deliver. But at least understanding the priority of those is important. And so, sometimes you try to accelerate when the schedule isn't actually the priority of those three, but either you're lacking in resources, there's no more to give, or there's a certain amount of scope that you can't cut any. And so understanding that, hey, we're going to try to accelerate. Obviously, everyone's going to try to get all three of those, but what's important and what's the priority? It's good to align on that, beforehand, so that when you do try to accelerate, first of all, that is the priority. And so you need to accelerate, and then you know what to cut. You're either adding resources, you're spending more money, or you're reducing scope. And everybody's in alignment beforehand that if it comes down to it, that's the thing that needs to give.
That's great. Understand what you're optimizing for.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jim, this has been lovely. Thank you so much for sharing some of your time today. Before we sign off, tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days and how people can get a hold of you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I am actually embarking on a company that offers services that are right in line with this discussion, focused on project, program, portfolio management, either at the individual capacity via training, in a PMO department with PMO optimization, or consulting services on projects and programs. And so that's my endeavor at the moment. And I can be reached on LinkedIn or a website called Archangel Operations. That's the name of the organization. So archangel.operations.com is a good way to contact and see if there's something that would be beneficial for an organization or an individual to benefit from on the topic of how to accelerate things within technical engineering and project and program management.
Terrific. Wonderful. Well, I hope this episode gets you a lot of visibility and folks reach out and start engaging with you on that.
Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jim. I think we'll call it good for here. And again, thank you for being on the Being an Engineer podcast and sharing some of your insights and wisdoms with the community.
Very well. Take care.
I'm Aaron Moncur, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing advanced manufacturing processes, automated machines, and custom fixtures, complemented with product design and R&D services, visit us at teampipeline.us. To join a vibrant community of engineers online, visit thewave.engineer. Thank you for listening.